On March 26, 1883, Mrs. Astor entered Alva Vanderbilt's new house on Fifth Avenue. That presence is documented. The famous story about a withheld invitation is not. The gap matters, because Alva's real victory was larger than a visiting card. She had made private standing, visible to newspapers, crowds, and a city already learning that old names no longer possessed all the money. The usual version is wonderfully compact. Mrs. Astor has never called on Alva. Alva therefore omits Mrs. Astor's daughter Carrie from the guest list. Carrie is meant to dance in a quadrille with her friends and cannot bear being left out. Mrs. Astor gives way, leaves her card at 665th Avenue, and the invitation arrives. One small rule is turned against the woman who policed the rules. It may have happened that way. The Museum of the City of New York calls the account apocryphal, and dress historian Madeline Porcella also treats it as possibly apocryphal. No reliable record supplies the private exchange, the pressure from Carrie, or Alva's words. What survives more securely is the result. Mrs. Astor attended. Carrie attended. Ward McAllister, Mrs. Astor's ally in the ordering of society, attended. Reporters had already been invited through the decorated rooms. More than 1,000 guests followed, while police held crowds along the street. That is a completed event even without the legend. A family that had been treated as socially questionable opened a new house, and the people credited with guarding old New York crossed its threshold in public. The uncertain story concerns how the invitation moved. The documented fact is that the gatekeepers came. If evidence-led histories of wealth and its machinery belong in your queue, subscribe to Dynasty and Dust. The line changes the question. If the episode depended on a single card, it would be a clever anecdote about etiquette. Once the card is placed inside the house, the press campaign, the street crowd, the labor, the costumes, and the changing economy of New York, the event becomes a study of power. Alva did not need every person in the city to approve of her. She needed refusal to become harder to maintain than standing. There is another correction to make at the start. In 1883, there was no printed, official 400 list waiting to receive the Vanderbilt name. Ward McAllister would publicly use the figure in 1888. His so-called official roster appeared in the New York Times in 1892, 9 years after the ball. Later stories fold those dates together because the result feels tidy. Mrs. Astor guards a list. Alva wins a place on it. The real sequence is less tidy and more revealing. First came the contest over standing. Later came the famous number and the attempt to freeze a moving society into print. So the ball did not open a fixed door. It exposed a door that old New York preferred to keep private. Before that night, standing could be managed through calls, dinners, dances, marriages, and quiet exclusions. After the ball, newspapers across the country could describe who had come, what they wore, and whose house had contained them. The gate had become news. This is why Mrs. Astor's arrival matters, even when the card story is uncertain. Her carriage did more than bring a guest. It supplied a public fact that no later refusal could entirely erase. The rest of the story is how Alva built the machine that made that fact visible. New York society did not have a government office, a written constitution, or a court of appeal. Its power lived inside repeated acts. A call was received or not received. A card was returned or ignored. A young woman appeared at the right dance, accompanied by the right relation, or found that no invitation came. A dinner placed one guest beside another and allowed both to treat the plan as ordinary. Each event looked private. Repetition made the pattern govern. Women occupied a central position in this system because the elite household was one of the few institutions in which a married woman could exercise visible power without holding public office. A hostess controlled invitations, introductions, seating, and the use of her rooms. Her decisions could help a daughter enter society, confirm an alliance between families, or leave a new fortune outside. The power was real. It was also narrow. It depended on wealth, marriage, servants, property, and the willingness of other households to answer in kind. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor carried an unusually strong set of credentials into that system. She was born into an old New York family and married into another. By the 1870s, her position joined family memory to the Astor fortune. Ward McAllister supplied group, language, and his appetite for sorting. Their power was never absolute, but it worked because enough established people behaved as though their judgments were worth consulting. McAllister later described the patriarch balls, begun in the early 1870s, as organized social power. A small body of men issued invitations to events that brought old Knickerbocker families together with the smart set. He used the language of passports. The comparison is useful if it is kept within limits. No police officer enforced the passport, and no statute defined its validity. The sanction was collective ease. If the accepted households welcomed you repeatedly, your presence stopped needing an explanation. If they did not, money alone could leave you standing outside a room you could easily have afforded. McAllister divided society into what he called knobs and swells. The knobs possessed older family standing. The swells possessed brilliance, wealth, manner, or usefulness, strong enough to press into the same rooms. The line was not stable. A commercial city kept producing new fortunes, while old families needed money, marriages, and entertaining partners. Gatekeeping, therefore, worked less like a stone wall than a committee that never published complete minutes. Its rules mattered, yet they could be revised through practice. That practice explains why a call at 665th Avenue carried weight. Calling was a small act with a long social memory. It acknowledged a household as one to which standing could properly be extended. A returned call continued the relationship. An invitation made the standing visible to more people. Presence confirmed it again. The sequence converted a private choice into a shared standard. The famous Carrie Astor story is persuasive because it understands this method. Even if its exact details cannot be proved, the story turns on a real feature of elite life. Mrs. Astor could not simply appear at a stranger's house without first recognizing the hostess through accepted forms. Alva's supposed maneuver made the form work against exclusion. Yet the form was only one layer. A calling card could be left quietly and remembered by a small circle. Alva arranged an event whose evidence would travel far beyond that circle. She was not trying to make the rules disappear. She was building a setting in which the rules would have to operate under observation. That required more than a guest list. It required a person who understood that household power could be enlarged by money, design, timing, and print. It required Alva Vanderbilt. Alva Erskine Smith was born in Mobile in 1853. Her family belonged to the slaveholding South, then lost much of its fortune after the Civil War. The National Park Service records the broad movement that followed. The family relocated, and Alva entered a world in which name and money could separate. She had family claims to gentility without the fortune needed to sustain them at the scale New York society increasingly expected. In 1875, she married William Kissam Vanderbilt, a grandson of Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt. The marriage joined her to one of the largest fortunes in the United States. It did not transfer the Vanderbilts into Old New York by the same automatic process. The source of the money remained too recent and too public. Cornelius Vanderbilt had built power in shipping and railroads. He was admired for wealth and ability, mocked for roughness, and remembered as a commercial force rather than a descendant of the families that presented themselves as New York's natural society. This was the central mismatch. The Vanderbilts possessed capital on a scale that could exceed the fortunes of established families. They did not possess the same inherited story about what the capital meant. Old families treated age as proof of discipline. New money exposed the uncomfortable possibility that an old name might be socially decisive while being economically smaller. Alva's available power came through marriage, property, and the control of display. She could not appoint herself to a public office that regulated society because no such office existed. She could not compel Mrs. Astor to call. She could spend, build, host, and create a case that other households would have to judge in front of one another. It is tempting to explain everything that followed with a single word: ambition. The word belongs here, but it does not explain the mechanics. Many rich people wanted standing. Most did not produce an event remembered more than a century later. Alva's line was not desire alone. It was her ability to convert money into a sequence of visible decisions. First came the house. A rented ballroom could hold a great party, and Delmonico's already served as a stage for New York's organized dances. A hotel or public hall, however, would display an event. It would not display the Vanderbilt household as a permanent fact on Fifth Avenue. Alva needed the guests to enter her threshold, move through her rooms, and accept hosting under her name. The choice carried risk. A great house without recognized guests could become proof of exclusion. New York already had a language for vulgar display, and contemporary satire was ready to use it. A building that demanded notice could make failure impossible to hide. The same being seen that promised social power could turn the family into a public joke. That helps explain the scale of planning. The house could not look like a hurried purchase of status. It had to suggest command over architecture, European model, decor, service, and ceremony. It also had to be new enough to belong unmistakably to the Vanderbilts. An inherited house might have supplied age. A new one could supply authorship. Alva and William chose Richard Morris Hunt, an American architect trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Hunt could translate European historical forms into an American commission without making the result appear like a builder's pile of ornaments. Catherine Moran describes his role as that of a cultural intermediary. He connected academic architectural authority to the desires of a client who wanted a new kind of American luxury. The marriage had given Alva the means. The absence of automatic standing gave the means a job. By the end of the 1870s, that job had an address. The site was 665th Avenue, near 50 Street, on a stretch of Manhattan, moving rapidly toward greater wealth and display. The project began while nearby members of the Vanderbilt family were establishing their own houses. Together, those commissions helped turn several blocks into what would be called Vanderbilt Row. A single new fortune could be dismissed as an intrusion. A family cluster looked more like occupation. Richard Morris Hunt did not give Alva another brownstone. He designed a French chateau for a New York lot. The house rose with a steep roof, carved stone, turrets, irregular openings, and a front that announced historical model from the pavement. The Library of Congress dates the project's completion to 1882. By the next spring, it was new enough to require a housewarming and finished enough to carry one of the most examined social events in the city. Calling the house French does not mean it reproduced one building in France. Its power came from studied assembly. Hunt knew how roof, window, stair, ceiling, panel, and decorative program could be made to belong to one argument. Moran calls 665th Avenue a total work of art and describes Alva's possession of it as performative identity. That phrasing captures the social job of the commission. The house offered more than rooms. It allowed Alva to appear as the person capable of selecting, coordinating, and commanding the whole. This form of authorship was especially important because architectural patronage gave a wealthy woman an accepted way to exercise sustained judgment. The architect brought professional power. Designers and craftspeople brought skill. The client's decisions still shaped the result. Alva could choose Hunt, approve a program, reject an option, and decide how the completed rooms would be used. Those actions did not require her to pretend that she had drawn the plans or carved the stone. The building also answered an old money claim with a new money method. Established families grounded status in descent. The Vanderbilts could not manufacture more ancestors. They could commission a house whose historical references arrived through scholarship, craft, and purchase. It did not make their money old. It made their taste difficult to dismiss as accidental. That was the argument, and it contained an obvious weakness. European historical forms could be read as learned choice or as copying. Joseph Kepler's political cartoon, Our Imitative Aristocracy, appeared in Puck on February 7, 1883, before Alva's ball. It mocked American magnates dressed in the clothes of supposed ancestors. William H. Vanderbilt was among the recognizable figures. The joke worked because the new fortunes wanted the look of a history they did not possess. Alva's answer was not to abandon historical costume or French architecture. She increased the scale and control of the show. If copying was unavoidable, it would be executed with enough skill to become influence. The risk remained, but so did a fact old families could not easily answer. Their own houses, dinners, and dances also relied on purchased labor, imported objects, and repeated performances of inherited rank. The ball would therefore place two claims inside the same rooms. One claim said that status came from continuity and welcome by established families. The other said that wealth, design, organization, and public mastery could create a new power in the present. Mrs. Astor's presence would later make the collision famous. Hunt's house made it possible before any invitation was delivered. To see how, the exterior is not enough. The important action occurred in the path from the curb to the rooms above. From Fifth Avenue, the house presented one face to the city. Inside, it had to manage several populations at once. Guests needed an approach that made arrival legible. Servants needed routes that allowed food, messages, clothing, flowers, and equipment to move without interrupting ceremony. Reporters needed enough access to describe the setting. The family needed private rooms beyond the public sequence. A successful ball made all of those movements appear to belong to one effortless evening. The surviving exterior photograph records Hunt's asymmetrical facade. The interior records make the claim more precise. A Library of Congress photograph shows the dining hall with a high coffered ceiling, a large chandelier, tapestries, framed art, and a decorative program associated with Herder Brothers. Another record preserves the third-floor plan. Hunt office drawings show paneled walls, fireplaces, ceiling designs, and carefully composed elevations. These sources do not permit a perfect reconstruction of every route on the night of the ball. Rooms changed, later photographs have their own dates, and one drawing carries a catalog caveat about exact attribution. They establish something more useful than a fantasy tour. The house was planned as a set of differentiated spaces. Ceremony, dining, circulation, and service had material locations. The event could expand because the building gave each work somewhere to occur. The guest's public route began before the door. Carriages approached a facade already known through advance reporting. The threshold separated the crowd from the invited guests. Inside, the hall and staircase allowed arrivals to become visible to one another. A stair does more than connect floors when hundreds of people are watching it. It turns movement into an entrance. The dining room carried another function. Its ceiling, tapestries, art, and table service placed food inside an architectural frame. Guests did not simply eat an expensive supper. They ate inside evidence that the household could coordinate decorative art, inherited model, cuisine, staff, and timing. The room made consumption look like culture. Higher in the house, spaces could be reassigned for the event. The museum account describes the third-floor gymnasium transformed with palms, bougainvillea, and orchids. The surviving plan makes that conversion more than a colorful story. It places the party inside a house, capable of absorbing a temporary indoor landscape without surrendering the main ceremonial rooms below. Every change added work. Plants had to be acquired, and carried upward. Floors had to be protected and prepared. Lighting had to function. Supper had to move from kitchen work to service at the required hour. Guests had to find rooms, partners, and places without being shown the machinery too plainly. The more effortless the spectacle appeared, the more teamwork it concealed. This is the first place where architecture becomes power rather than decor. The house sorted access. Crowds remained outside. Invited guests crossed the threshold. Servants moved across another set of routes. Reporters were admitted at a chosen time and for a chosen purpose. Alva's power lay partly in deciding when each group could enter and what each group would see. Mrs. Astor could judge an invitation. She could not privately control a house that had been designed around another woman's decisions. Once she entered Alva's sequence. Before any guest did that, however, the sequence was tested on the people who would carry it into print. Alva invited journalists to preview the house before the ball began. The decision was simple enough to describe and unusual enough to change the scale of the event. A private hostess normally controlled knowledge through the guest list. Alva created a second list whose members did not need to dance, dine, or possess old family names. They needed to observe and publish. Advance access gave the reporters time to turn decor into standard. The invitations were already circulating. Dressmakers and cobblers had been working from historical books. Young guests rehearsed quadrilles. Newspapers could describe these preparations before the first carriage arrived, allowing readers to follow a private event as an approaching public occasion. The preview also changed the meaning of the house. A residence usually revealed itself gradually, through the people received there. Reporters allowed 665th Avenue to be described in concentrated form. Rooms, flowers, costumes, and arrangements became copy. Readers who would never receive an invitation could still compare the Vanderbilt house with other houses they knew only from print. This was not modern advertising in disguise. The newspaper world of 1883 had its own conventions, rivalries, and interests. Editors chose what to run. Reporters could praise, mock, itemize, or condemn. Alva could supply access and material. She could not guarantee the verdict. That limit made the strategy more credible. A notice written entirely by the hostess would prove only that she wanted notice. Independent papers repeating details created the look of a city compelled to notice. Even hostile coverage enlarged the event's reach. A critic could condemn the cost and still repeat the figures, the address, and the names. The social effect came from sequence. First, the press established that a great event was coming. Then the street could watch carriages arrive. The next morning, reports could confirm who had attended. The public did not need access to the ballroom to understand the outcome. It needed a chain of observations that agreed. This is where the Carrie Astor story becomes less necessary. A withheld invitation provides a clean, private cause. The press strategy provides a documented public method. If Mrs. Astor stayed away, absence would occur in an event whose guest list and spectacle had already become news. If she attended, standing would be equally visible. Alva had arranged a case in which either choice could be discussed beyond Mrs. Astor's own drawing room. The reporter's preview, therefore, widened the contest without settling it. Old New York still possessed social power. The Vanderbilts still faced attack. The gap was that standing could no longer occur as a quiet concession, known only to the people who exchanged cards. It would be attached to a date, an address, and a published list of scenes. Print also separated the event from the lifespan of gossip. A private remark fades when the people who heard it stop repeating it. A newspaper report can be clipped, copied, quoted in another city, and used by a later memoirist. The original reader might care about a costume or a scandal. The accumulated archive preserves the larger pattern. This persistence was not under Alva's full control, but her decision to admit reporters supplied the material that persistence required. Catherine Moran's idea of the house as performative identity is especially useful here. A show required an audience. The invited guests were one audience. The press created another, much larger audience that received the house through description and image. The audience beyond the walls could not validate every detail, but it could remember the central fact that the great names had entered. Alva had opened the building to print before opening it to society. That choice created pressure. It also created a practical deadline. The rooms now had to deliver what the advanced descriptions promised, and hundreds of people had to appear inside them in arrangements that looked deliberate. The remaining work was not rhetorical. It involved cards, cloth, rehearsals, routes, food, flowers, police, and a small army of people whose names the society columns rarely treated as the point. An invitation began as a piece of paper, but its effect depended on delivery, response, planning, and teamwork. The museum account says servants in livery hand-delivered the Vanderbilt invitations. That method attached the household to the card before the recipient opened it. The servant, clothing, address, and paper arrived as one controlled signal. Acceptance created several new obligations. A guest needed a costume. Some costumes were historical characters. Others were allegorical figures, animals, literary roles, or inventions. The best dressmakers and cobblers worked for months, consulting books so that a sleeve, shoe, headdress, or uniform could withstand scrutiny from people who believed correctness demonstrated taste. Costume made presence more demanding than an ordinary ball. A guest could not decide at the final hour to appear in standard evening dress without announcing refusal of the central premise. The invitation requested labor and expense from everyone who accepted it. That request gave the hostess unusual influence over how her guests would enter the room. The quadrilles required another kind of commitment. A quadrille was danced by 4 couples in a rectangular formation, but the Vanderbilt program enlarged the form into organized groups with themed costumes and prepared entrances. Participants rehearsed for weeks. Each person depended on partners arriving, remembering positions, and accepting the same visual idea. The work, therefore, had several failure points. A costume might not be ready. A participant might withdraw. A carriage could arrive late. One missing dancer could disturb a formation. A delayed supper could collide with the next stage of the evening. A crowded stare could stop looking ceremonial and start looking like poor control. Alva did not personally stitch every costume, train every dancer, deliver every card, or schedule every carriage. Her power came through selecting a structure that required other people to coordinate around her event. That distinction keeps the feat in scale. The ball was not one woman's solitary creation. It was a temporary organization with the Vanderbilt household at its center. The guest list also served more than one purpose. It identified people Alva wanted in the house. It supplied partners for the quadrilles. It drew established families into the same rooms as new fortunes. It created a record for the press. A guest list can appear to be a statement of taste while functioning as a map of alliances. This is why the supposed omission of Carrie Astor has such power in later retellings. The story imagines a single blank space doing the work of hundreds of names, yet the entire list mattered. Mrs. Astor's standing would be meaningful because other guests were prepared to witness it. Without the surrounding network, one invitation could be dismissed as a private compromise. Planning distributed anticipation across the city. Dressmakers knew what their clients would wear. Households knew who was rehearsing with whom. Newspapers knew enough to publish descriptions. People excluded from the event could still discuss it. The ball existed socially before it existed in time. By March 26, the invited elite had invested money, hours, and name in Alva's success. That investment narrowed the possibility of treating the night as an eccentric Vanderbilt display. Too many accepted families had helped produce it. The hostess had turned guests into participants, and participants into evidence. The visible planning, however, rested on work that carried less prestige. Every delivery, fitting, rehearsal, and table required somebody to handle material, time, and mess. The invitation made the demand. Labor made the promise possible. The great house presented hosting as a quality of the family. In practice, hosting was a chain of occupations. Cooks, kitchen workers, butlers, footmen, housemaids, laundresses, valets, ladies' maids, coachmen, grooms, florists, dressmakers, cobblers, musicians, decorators, and temporary staff carried different parts of the evening. Some worked in the house, others for suppliers or guests. Their effort converged at one address and was credited upward to the hostess. Ward McAllister provides an unusually direct account of the climb. Looking back in 1890, he wrote that New York society had turned over a new leaf as fortunes rose from $1 million to $10, $50, and $100 million. A dinner that once used 2 servants now demanded 5 or 6 plus the butler. He noted that a butler's monthly pay rose from $40 to between $60 and $75. A second man rose from $20 to $35 or $40. Extra men for a dinner cost more again. Those numbers come from a participant who celebrated skillful entertaining and had reasons to present the change as a social era. They are valuable because his enthusiasm does not hide the labor requirement. Greater display meant more workers at the threshold and table. The standard of apparent ease rose by increasing the number of people required to produce it. The Vanderbilt ball multiplied the problem beyond dinner. More than 1,000 guests could not be handled as a larger version of a family supper. Clothing had to be received and protected. Arrivals had to be directed. Rooms needed constant notice. Food and drink had to move at scale. The Delmonico's chefs who supplied supper depended on service within a house they did not normally operate. Flowers and plants occupied space, shed material, blocked routes, and required care. The third-floor indoor garden illustrates the transfer of credit. Guests saw palms, orchids, and bougainvillea arranged as a sudden landscape. The effect belonged to Alva's ball. The physical work belonged to people who selected, transported, lifted, placed, watered, and later removed the plants. A temporary forest is still freight when it is moving up a service route. The same rule applied to costumes. Society pages named the wearer and described the designer when the designer was famous enough. Behind each finished figure stood fitting, fastening, pressing, repair, and last-minute adjustment. A costume based on an old book required someone to find or make materials that could reproduce the page on a living body. This does not mean every worker experienced the night in the same way, or that the record permits a composite servant to speak for them. Their wages, conditions, and relationships varied. Many names are absent from the surviving accounts. The responsible claim is structural. The spectacle kept many people's work out of view while turning its result into the social power of one household. That transfer was ordinary to elite domestic life. The scale made it easier to see. When McAllister described 5 or 6 servants receiving guests, he was describing people positioned as part of the architecture. Livery joined a worker visually to the house. Service discipline allowed the guest to experience order without having to ask how it was maintained. The ball's labor, therefore, carried a double burden. It had to succeed, and it had to disappear as labor. A delayed plate, crowded hall, stained costume, or lost wrap would become a failure of hosting. Perfect service would be remembered as Vanderbilt magnificence. The reported cost figures can recover part of the material scale. They cannot restore every name. They can show what kinds of work the money was expected to command. Most institutional accounts place the ball's total near $250,000. A New York World estimate, repeated in later reporting, itemized $11,000 for flowers, $4,000 for carriages, $65,000 for champagne, catering, and cigars, $4,000 for hairdressers, and more than $155,000 for costumes. Other summaries vary. None is an audited Vanderbilt ledger. That limit should stay beside the figures. Newspapers had reasons to enlarge spectacle. Later writers had reasons to convert it into a modern dollar shock. Price comparisons across more than a century depend on which measure is chosen. Consumer prices, wages, wealth, and share of the economy produce very different answers. A single conversion can look exact while hiding the decision behind it. The contemporary categories are more useful than a modern total. Flowers meant growers, wholesalers, transport, conditioning, arrangement, and removal. Carriages meant vehicles, horses, drivers, stable work, traffic control, and waiting space. Catering meant kitchens, ingredients, cooks, serving equipment, delivery, and teamwork with the household staff. Hairdressers and costumes extended the labor across hundreds of separate households. The categories also reveal where the estimate stops. It does not reliably capture use of the house, wear on furnishings, ordinary wages already carried on household accounts, or the unpaid time guests devoted to rehearsals and fittings. A single total can make the event look like one purchase. In practice, the cost was dispersed across prior building, current household expense, supplier bills, and spending by invited families. The $65,000 category for champagne, food, and cigars is often repeated because it sounds outrageous. It also shows how newspapers packaged the event. Several operations were combined under one spectacular figure. The number did not tell readers how much went to wine, wages, ingredients, or supplier profit. It told them that consumption itself had become news. The costume estimate carried a different message. If guests collectively spent more on clothing than the host spent on several household categories, the ball had distributed its cost through the network. Alva's fortune created the event, but the participating families paid to complete its visual program. Each accepted invitation recruited another budget. That is the financial method beneath the quadrilles. The hostess selected a theme and date. Guests commissioned individual representations. Suppliers competed for work. Newspapers described the results. The social prestige returned mainly to the people wearing the costumes and to the household that assembled them. Money moved outward through trades and services, while standing moved inward toward 665th Avenue. The estimated total also invited moral comparison. New York in the 1880s contained long hours, low wages, insecure housing, and working families far removed from the ball. The New York Historical places the photographs of elite costumes inside the history of industrialization and labor for that reason. The same economy that enlarged railroad and manufacturing fortunes also subjected workers to conditions that made such private spending look like a public argument about distribution. The argument appeared quickly. The New York Sun criticized the excess in a city with suffering. That attack did not erase the event. It widened the audience by giving readers a reason to discuss what the party represented. Praise and condemnation carried the same address. This is another reason the ball cannot be reduced to etiquette. A calling card concerns membership. A $250,000 estimate concerns political economy, even when the number is uncertain. It asks how a fortune becomes flowers, clothes, servants, and champagne, and why the conversion should prove fitness to rule a social world. Alva's event offered one answer. Wealth demonstrated command when it could organize people and objects into a coherent public result. Critics offered another. The result demonstrated a society willing to confuse expenditure with worth. That dispute did not begin after the last dance. A colored cartoon had already placed the new American aristocracy in costume and invited the country to laugh. On February 7, 1883, 7 weeks before the Vanderbilt ball, Puck published Joseph Kepler's Our Imitative Aristocracy. The Library of Congress describes the print as a costume ball in which guests wear the clothing of their ancestors. Jay Gould, William H. Vanderbilt, Ulysses S. Grant, and other public figures appear among the recognizable faces. The cartoon's timing matters. It was not a later verdict on Alva's night. It shows that the language of costume, ancestry, and copying was already available to attack the wealthy. The Vanderbilt name entered the joke before 665th Avenue opened its ballroom. Kepler's figures borrow the visual claim of European nobility. The humor lies in the mismatch between costume and lineage. American industrial fortunes could buy the clothes, jewels, houses, and manners associated with aristocracy. Purchase could not make the claimed ancestors real. Old New York might seem protected by that attack. Families with longer local histories could present themselves as the authentic alternative to commercial newcomers. Yet the cartoon also unsettled them. American old money was not European nobility either. Its rituals, borrowed freely from courts, country houses, and aristocratic social codes. The gap was degree, memory, and confidence, not complete independence from copying. The date sharpens another point. Kepler could assume that readers recognized the leading fortunes and understood the social claim of ancestral dress. Elite life had already become a form of mass culture. The people excluded from the balls were still expected to know the cast, understand the joke, and purchase the image. The ball and the cartoon depended on the same public interest, while asking that interest to reach opposite verdicts. Alva's ball entered this exposed field and did not retreat. Guests arrived as Venetian princesses, historical monarchs, monks, cats, hornets, literary figures, and allegories. The event made copying explicit, then treated mastery of it as taste. A historically studied costume could prove knowledge. An extravagant one could prove resources. A coordinated quadrille could prove social command. The strategy risked confirming every accusation. A new fortune wearing a jeweled peacock and entertaining in a French chateau could look like the cartoon made solid. Contemporary attack found ample material. The taxidermied cat heads and tails on Kate Fearing-Strong's costume have continued to attract notice because they are difficult to fit inside any restrained account of taste. The risk did not cancel the social result. Mrs. Astor and McAllister attended an event that critics could call copying. Their presence made it harder to treat the event as simply outside society. Condemnation and standing occurred together. This coexistence is important. Social power rarely requires unanimous praise. It requires the ability to make other important people respond. By that standard, satire could confirm the scale of Alva's success, even as it attacked her values. The ball had become too visible to ignore. The cartoon also clarifies the deeper contest over time. Old families claimed that rank accumulated through generations. New fortunes lived in a city where railroads, finance, industry, and land could produce economic power within one life. Costume allowed both sides to stage their preferred relation to history. One could wear an inherited past, another could select a past, commission it, and present it with greater material force. Alice Vanderbilt's electric light dress would carry the new money answer furthest. It did not pretend to represent an ancestor. It represented a technology changing the present. Before reaching that object, the knight had to bring the city's competing histories to the same curb. At about 10 in the evening, the carriages began to arrive. The argument left the printed page and entered Fifth Avenue traffic. The approach to 660 Fifth Avenue turned private presence into a street event. Carriages began arriving around 10. The precise count of guests varies by account, but the most reliable summaries place the total above 1,000, with the Museum of the City of New York using nearly 1,200. A single household was receiving a population larger than many theaters could hold. Carriages concentrate people slowly. Each vehicle needs space to approach, stop, unload, and move away. Horses cannot be folded into a cloakroom. Drivers must wait or return at an arranged time. When hundreds of invited guests share one address, the street becomes part of the event's machinery. Police held back crowds who had come to watch. That detail places the ball beyond the household boundary. Public officers were managing people who had no invitation, but still wanted a view of the arrivals. The city was not sponsoring Alva's social campaign. It was responding to the physical consequences of its scale. For the crowd, the threshold supplied a sequence of brief appearances. A carriage door opened. A costumed figure crossed the pavement. Jewels, fabric, headpieces, weapons, tails, feathers, or uniforms were visible for a few moments before disappearing inside. The spectators could not judge the supper or the quadrilles. They could judge who had come and how much trouble the event had created. The curb, therefore, produced a rough public guest list before the newspapers printed one. An important name could be recognized. A conspicuous costume could be remembered. Mrs. Astor's arrival could be seen, discussed, and later confirmed in print. Standing was becoming an observable act. This did not make the crowd socially equal to the guests. The police line enforced the opposite. The house divided invited guests from spectators more sharply than an ordinary private dinner would have done. The ball enlarged public notice while preserving physical exclusion. That combination is characteristic of Gilded Age display. A facade needs viewers. A publicized ball needs readers and spectators. The value of exclusivity rises when many people know they are excluded. Alva's success depended on the crowd remaining outside while understanding that the right people had gone in. The invited guests faced their own difficulty. Costume made entrance less ordinary. A person dressed as a monarch, a monk, a demon, an animal, or electric light had to cross a real sidewalk, pass real police, and enter a modern New York house. The short route joined fantasy to civic space. It also exposed the wearer to laughter, praise, or both. Inside, servants received the arrivals and directed them onward. The staff had to recognize names beneath costumes, manage clothing and personal items, and keep the hall moving. A delayed cluster at the door could block the next carriage outside. The sequence depended on decisions made quickly by workers, whose presence was supposed to confirm the household's control. By the time Mrs. Astor crossed the threshold, the event had acquired several audiences. The street watched the entrance. Reporters possessed advanced descriptions. Guests watched one another. Staff watched the flow, because they had to keep it functioning. Alva occupied the one position from which these separate lines could be treated as a single event. Her house now contained the people whose standing she sought. The next task was to move them through rooms designed to make their presence look inevitable. The front door did not open directly into a ballroom detached from the household. Guests entered a residence whose rooms had been arranged to demonstrate continuity between family life, architecture, art, and spectacle. That continuity was part of the claim. Alva was not borrowing a public stage for one night. She was receiving society inside a setting that would remain when the costumes were put away. The hall and principal stair, organized being seen. In a large house, stairs connect levels. During an arrival, they also create distance, pause, and elevation. A group descending into a quadrille could be seen before reaching the floor. Guests waiting below could observe costumes as a composition rather than as isolated people. The dining hall offered a different form of power. The surviving photograph shows a coffered ceiling, chandelier, tapestries, art, and a room meant to hold notice above and around the table. Herder brothers contributed to the interior. The effect depended on craft distributed across architecture, furniture, textile, metal, lighting, and service. The service work ran beside that visible route. Food prepared or supplied through Delmonico's had to enter the house, remain fit for service, and reach guests at the planned time. Plates, glassware, linen, bottles, trays, waste, and water all moved. The public rooms could appear full without becoming impassable to the workers supporting them. The surviving plan of the third floor helps explain how the house absorbed another layer of party. The museum account says the gymnasium became an indoor garden of palms, orchids, and bougainvillea. A room associated with exercise was temporarily reassigned to fantasy. Guests moving upward encountered another environment without leaving the Vanderbilt address. The change demonstrated more than expense. It showed the household's ability to make a room change function on command. That ability is a form of power. Space usually constrains an event. Here, labor and money made the space appear obedient. It was never fully obedient. Plants occupy floors and routes. Large costumes need clearance. A jeweled headdress changes how a person passes through a doorway. More than 1,000 guests create heat, delay, and congestion, even when no account records a disaster. The absence of a famous breakdown suggests the work generally held. The house also allowed different groups to encounter one another under Alva's terms. An old family and a new fortune could share a landing, supper room, or view of the quadrilles. The room did not erase their distinctions. It made avoidance harder. Every accepted invitation increased the number of relationships temporarily housed together. This is why the architecture mattered more than sheer size. A warehouse can hold a crowd. A house of carefully ordered rooms can make the crowd look like society. Hunt's design gave Alva a sequence in which arrival became ceremony, dining became culture, and circulation became evidence of belonging. The building's historical references did one more kind of work. They placed new Vanderbilt money inside a visual past. The guests did not have to agree that the family possessed ancient lineage. They had to navigate rooms whose design demonstrated access to the knowledge, craftsmen, and objects through which lineage was performed. At 11:30, The architecture delivered its most controlled image. The first quadrille began, and the guests who had spent weeks rehearsing turned the staircase into a moving composition. The opening was the hobby horse quadrille. Contemporary descriptions and McAllister's memoir preserve a group arranged around a comic martial theme. The exact visual details vary across accounts, but the governing fact is firm. This was one of 5 prepared quadrilles, and it began at a documented time. That precision distinguishes the quadrilles from general dancing. At 11:30, participants had to be ready in the correct costumes, with the correct partners, in the correct order. The audience had to be positioned to see them. Musicians and household staff had to support the entrance. Weeks of rehearsal were converted into a few minutes that could not be restarted without exposing the machinery. The Dresden quadrille drew on the court of Frederick the Great. White costumes and historical styling made the dancers resemble porcelain figures. The opera bouffe group moved toward theatrical exaggeration. One dress, described in the press, carried a black velvet demon and a fringe of small demon heads and horns. Other groups offered different periods, colors, and references. The sequence allowed variety inside control. Every quadrille had its own idea, yet all belonged to one Vanderbilt program. That structure resembles the social argument of the event. Old families, new fortunes, historical characters, and modern allegories could remain distinct while appearing inside an order chosen by the hostess. Quadrille dancing also required visible cooperation. A solitary guest could wear a magnificent costume and still prove only personal wealth. A rehearsed group proved that several households had coordinated time and look around Alva's invitation. The dancers became evidence of her organizing reach. The audience participated through recognition. They could identify a person, admire a jewel, judge historical accuracy, or compare one group with the next. Their notice completed the display. Social power was being produced through a room full of people who knew how to read the details. McAllister attended in costume as a figure linked to Margaret of Valois. His presence matters because he was not a neutral observer. He had helped organize the rituals through which elite New York recognized itself. At 665th Avenue, he entered a ritual organized by Alva and later placed it inside his account of a new era. Mrs. Astor's role was quieter in the surviving descriptions. That quiet can encourage invention, as though the story needs a visible surrender. It does not. Presence supplied the social fact. She did not have to announce defeat or praise the hostess. By remaining in the house while the quadrilles proceeded, she accepted the event as one at which her own presence was proper. After the prepared groups, the evening widened into general dancing. Supper came at about 2 in the morning. The indoor garden, dining rooms, and other spaces allowed guests to circulate beyond the formal sequence. Alva later led a Virginia reel near the end. The local payoff had already arrived. The new house had opened. The prepared program had succeeded, and the people credited with old New York's power had watched it from inside. The ball no longer needed a perfect anecdote to prove standing. Its entire work had become the proof. One costume pushed that proof beyond historical mastery. Alice Claypool Vanderbilt entered as electric light, carrying a technology that old lineage could not claim as its private inheritance. The electric light ensemble was made of white satin, diamonds, metallic detail, and a torch powered by batteries concealed with the costume. Alice Claypool Vanderbilt, the wife of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, wore it as an allegory of a new technology. The dress survives in the Museum of the City of New York. Survival changes the kind of claim that can be made. Many descriptions of the ball pass through later memory. The dress is material evidence. Its fabric, building, decor, and associated photograph allow historians to examine an object made for the night, rather than only a story told about it. Madeline Porcella reads the ensemble as a statement of modern age. That interpretation gains force from comparison. Many guests chose figures from European history, literature, or court life. Alice appeared as a force changing the present. Diamonds formed flashes across the dress. The torch made electricity portable and wearable. Electric lighting was not an abstract symbol in 1883. It was a developing system of generators, wiring, lamps, patents, investment, and public demonstration. New York had seen electric light displayed as technological promise. A battery-powered costume could turn that promise into social theater without requiring the wearer to pretend she had inherited it from an ancestor. The ensemble, therefore, answered Kepler's joke in a different register. An imitative aristocracy looked backward for costumes that could lend age to new fortunes. Electric light claimed that new fortune possessed another source of legitimacy. The industrial present had produced wealth, and the present could produce its own imagery. The claim was selective. Railroads and industrial capital affected workers, land, law, and public life far beyond a ballroom. The dress converted technology into glamour, while leaving those costs outside the frame. Its modern age belonged to the wearer because other people had made electricity, batteries, fabric, and diamonds available for display. That selective conversion is precisely why the object matters. It shows how the Gilded Age made systems personal. A railroad fortune became a necklace. Electrical technology became a torch. Industrial labor became a smooth surface of satin. The wearer did not carry an account book. She carried a lightning bolt. The surviving dress also complicates the language of victory. The house that contained the ball was later demolished. Many other Vanderbilt houses disappeared. The list of guests became disputed and legendary. The object endured because it entered a museum holdings. Its survival separates material residue from social memory. The dress cannot prove what Mrs. Astor thought. It cannot establish the private exchange behind an invitation. It can prove that the Vanderbilts presented industrial modernity as a form of social power, and that the presentation was made with enough craft to remain legible long after the event. At the midpoint of the story, the object offers a better anchor than the withheld card. The card may have existed, but its decisive drama comes from later narration. The dress exists now. It belonged to the event. It carried a claim that fits the documented change around it. Old New York had offered lineage as the reason its judgments should govern. Electric light supplied a rival answer. The future was generating fortunes too large to remain socially invisible. With that material answer in view, the card legend can be tested without fear that the whole episode will collapse if the legend does. The Carrie Astor story survives because every part of it performs a useful narrative job. It gives Alva a plan, Carrie a personal stake, Mrs. Astor a dilemma, and the visiting card a visible result. It turns a diffuse contest over money and lineage into one move followed by one countermove. The weakness is provenance. Later accounts repeat the episode in confident detail, but the most careful institutional and scholarly treatments mark it as apocryphal, or possibly so. The surviving material does not securely establish the private exchange, the daughter's distress, or the exact intent behind an omission. Absence of proof is not proof that the incident never occurred. Social customs often operate through unwritten exchanges. Families with reasons to protect privacy do not necessarily preserve the card that later viewers want. The responsible conclusion is narrower. The story cannot carry exact dialogue, motive, or a claim that Alva designed the entire ball around one girl's invitation. The strongest surviving facts remain. Mrs. Astor had not treated the Vanderbilts as social equals in the way Alva wanted. Calls and invitations mattered. Mrs. Astor and Carrie attended the ball. McAllister attended. The event received extraordinary press notice. Those facts establish standing without establishing the famous pressure sequence. 3 explanations can therefore be compared. The first is the classic maneuver. Alva withheld the invitation and forced Mrs. Astor to call. It fits the rules and the outcome, but it lacks secure contemporary proof for its dramatic details. The second is gradual acceptance. The Vanderbilts had become too wealthy, too present on Fifth Avenue, and too connected to exclude indefinitely. The ball marked a change already underway. This account fits the broader economy, though it can understate Alva's control of timing and spectacle. The third is public pressure, created by the event itself, advance reporting, widespread planning, a large accepted guest list, and the new house made absence visible. Mrs. Astor could attend without conceding every future judgment, but refusal would now have to survive public comparison with the people who accepted. This method is documented in its components and does not depend on private dialogue. The explanations are not mutually exclusive. A card may have moved inside a wider process. Gradual acceptance may have created the conditions in which Alva's timing worked. Publicity may have raised the cost of refusal. The record supports the wider process more strongly than the perfect anecdote. That changes the meaning of Alva's success. Clever manipulation belongs to one moment. Building a public method required years of planning. A house, professional design, staff, suppliers, guests, and press. It also required a city in which new fortunes had become too large to fit comfortably outside old society. The card story remains useful as evidence of how later generations wanted the conflict to be remembered. It places women at the center, treats etiquette as a weapon, and gives the older order a clean defeat. Its popularity shows that people understood calls and invitations as real instruments of power. The better conclusion is provisional but strong. Alva may have used the visiting card rule exactly as tradition says. Her documented victory did not depend on that move alone. By the time Mrs. Astor entered 665th Avenue, the House and the press had made her presence public evidence. The other famous object in the story, the 400 list, needs the same chronological discipline. In 1883, it was not yet the printed institution later memory places at the door. Ward McAllister told the New York Tribune in 1888 that there were about 400 people in fashionable New York society. He explained the number through ballroom ease. "Go beyond it," he said, and one encountered people who were uncomfortable in a ballroom or made others uncomfortable. The remark turned a flexible social judgment into a memorable quantity. The number did not arrive with a printed roll of names. It worked first as a claim about scale and competence. McAllister presented society as a body small enough to know itself and refined enough to detect discomfort. The arithmetic gave personal preference the look of a boundary. 4 years later, on February 16, 1892, the New York Times published what it called the only official 400, supplied by McAllister in response to competing lists. The roster did not contain a perfectly ordered 400 names. That imperfection is revealing. A phrase meant to express confidence became harder to control when attached to individuals in print. The chronology matters. The Vanderbilt ball occurred in 1883. McAllister's public figure came in 1888. The printed list came in 1892. Any account that says Alva held the ball to enter an established official roster imports a later institution into an earlier conflict. What existed in 1883 was more powerful in some ways and less stable in others. Mrs. Astor, McAllister, the patriarchs, family networks, calls, dinners, and dances created a recognizable elite. People knew that inclusion and exclusion were real even when no public document settled every case. The absence of a list gave gatekeepers flexibility. A new family could be admitted to one event without forcing a permanent declaration. A person might belong in Newport and remain uncertain in New York. Wealth, marriage, scandal, age, and usefulness could alter a household's position. Private ambiguity protected the people making the judgments. Alva's ball reduced that protection. Newspapers could name attendees and describe a visible convergence. The event did not force McAllister to issue a constitution. It supplied a public outcome that later sorting had to absorb. When the printed roster finally appeared, the Vanderbilt family could not plausibly be treated as wholly outside the world it claimed to define. This does not mean the 1892 list was a direct response to the ball. Too many changes filled the 9 years between them. Fortunes grew, marriages shifted relations, houses rose, and McAllister's own public role changed. The connection is structural. The same society that once managed standing through private practice increasingly found itself described, ranked, and challenged in mass print. McAllister helped create that news. His memoir, Society as I Have Found It, appeared in 1890. It offered readers an insider's account of entertaining, social organizations, famous households, food, wine, servants, and the standards by which he judged them. A man who defended elite privacy also made a career from explaining it. That clash belonged to the age. Social power gained value from secrecy and from public interest at the same time. The 400 sounded exclusive because most people were outside it. It became famous because newspapers carried the number to millions who would never seek admission. Alva's 1883 strategy had occupied that same clash earlier. She used exclusivity to attract notice, then used notice to make standing harder to deny. The list came later, because the gate was already being dragged into print. The next question is, what news changed in the choices available to Mrs. Astor and the people who followed her lead? A private social judgment is easiest to maintain when its evidence remains private. Mrs. Astor could decline to call on a household, and the meaning of that absence would be understood mainly by people who watched calls closely. The excluded family might resent the slight, but public proof would be difficult to isolate. The Vanderbilt ball changed the cost structure of refusal. Advance notices had made the event important. Accepted guests had invested in costumes and rehearsals. More than 1,000 people were expected. Crowds and police would make the approach visible. Reporters would describe the result. If Mrs. Astor stayed away, her absence could be read as a deliberate rejection of an event many recognized families had accepted. That might preserve her standard. It might also reveal that her standard no longer controlled the room. If she attended, the Vanderbilt household gained standing. Mrs. Astor could still judge future invitations case by case, and presence did not make Alva her equal in every private feeling. The public record would nonetheless place her inside 665th Avenue. The important shift is that neither choice remained purely private. Alva had not removed Mrs. Astor's power. She had arranged a case in which exercising that power carried visible consequences. Architecture strengthened the pressure. A party at Delmonico's could be treated as one event among many. Presence at the Vanderbilt house acknowledged the household's place on Fifth Avenue and its capacity to host society within a permanent setting. The guest crossed not only a ballroom entrance but a family threshold. The press strengthened it again. A visiting card could be interpreted by insiders. A published report could be read in other cities, repeated in later memoirs, and attached to photographs. Recognition acquired duration. This method explains why spending alone was insufficient. New York contained many expensive interiors and many fortunes. Money became socially effective when it organized a response from people who claimed the right to judge it. The ball forced such a response without legal compulsion. The method also explains why attack did not necessarily damage the result. A newspaper could condemn waste and still confirm that Mrs. Astor attended. The moral verdict and the social fact traveled together. Readers might dislike the Vanderbilts more while doubting their exclusion less. Publicity, therefore, did not create respectability in a simple upward line. It made the family unavoidable. Unavoidability is a lower standard than praise, but it is often the necessary condition for power. Once rivals must respond, the contest has already changed. The wider economy supplied the pressure beneath the event. Industrial and railroad fortunes had grown beyond the amounts that older households once treated as exceptional. McAllister wrote of values leaping from 1 million to 10, 50, and 100 million. His numbers were rhetorical as well as descriptive, but his conclusion was plain. The scale of wealth had changed the scale of living. Old society could admit selected newcomers and preserve its language of taste. New fortunes could seek standing and adopt older rituals. The result was not a clean transfer from Astor to Vanderbilt. It was a revised bargain. Money would not automatically command admission, but inherited name could no longer act as though money of this scale did not alter the room. The ball mattered because it made that bargain visible. Whether it changed society or merely displayed a change already underway remains the strongest challenge to the episode's title. The skeptical reading begins with a fair point. The ball was theater. It lasted one night. Guests wore costumes, rooms became temporary landscapes, and much of the reported expenditure vanished into flowers, food, drink, transport, and clothing. The next morning, Mrs. Astor still possessed her name. McAllister still organized elite events. Working New Yorkers remained outside the house. The event also depended on wealth, so exceptional that few newcomers could copy it. A method available only to a railroad dynasty is not an open social system. If admission required a French chateau and a $250,000 party estimate, the hierarchy had widened only for the richest challengers. Those concessions narrow the claim. The ball did not democratize society. It did not end exclusion. It did not transfer a throne from one woman to another. It did not cause every mansion built afterward. The evidence still shows more than display. McAllister's own memoir placed the great fancy dress ball inside a chapter he called An Era of Extravagance. He wrote that New York society had turned over a new leaf and later called the season a great social shift that reached Newport. His language was expansive and self-interested. It is nonetheless the judgment of a participant who had helped maintain the earlier order. His account of servants, wages, food, flowers, and fortunes also identifies structural change. The standards of elite life were rising because the available wealth was rising. Established families could condemn extravagance while adapting to it. The social order survived by absorbing some of the people whose resources threatened to outgrow it. The press record supplies another change. The ball became a national model point for Gilded Age excess and social competition. A private system that depends on quiet distinctions becomes less stable when its decisions are reproduced as party for readers. Public interest gives outsiders no vote, but it denies gatekeepers full control over the story. Kepler's satire strengthens the challenge and the answer. The new aristocracy could be mocked as copying. That mockery did not make the fortunes disappear. It showed that Americans were already arguing about whether economic power could purchase social power. The Vanderbilt ball did not invent the argument. It gave the argument a spectacular case. The best causal claim is therefore limited. The ball accelerated and publicized a bargain already created by industrial wealth, changing urban space, and a growing press. It demonstrated that old money standing could be compelled to respond when new money acted in concert. The response was adaptation rather than collapse. This kind of change can be durable even when the event is temporary. A successful demonstration alters expectations. Later hosts know what scale has been achieved. Architects know what clients have seen. Newspapers know that readers will follow elite contests. Guests know that attending a new fortune's house no longer places them outside society. The cost of victory appears here. Alva raised the standard she and others would be expected to meet. A house became a public claim, requiring upkeep. A great event became the comparison for the next event. Standing, purchased through spectacle, creates pressure for more spectacle. The ball changed the bargain, then locked its participants into the consequences. Old families adapted, new fortunes built. Servants and suppliers carried the higher standard. Newspapers rewarded climb with notice. The social shift McAllister named was not a shift of equality. It was a shift in the price and public visibility of elite power. Its next great stage stood beside the sea at Newport. McAllister wrote that the social shift of the winter reached Newport. His phrasing should not be mistaken for a measured causal study. It identifies how an insider experienced the spread of a new scale. The summer colony, long governed by established routines and old relationships, became another field in which large fortunes could build, host, and reorganize notice. Newport already possessed wealthy households before Alva arrived there. Its change cannot be credited to one New York ball. The ball belongs to a wider sequence in which American elites shifted from substantial summer houses toward the stone palaces now used to define the Gilded Age. Alva and William commissioned Marble House from Richard Morris Hunt between 1888 and 1892. The Preservation Society of Newport County describes it as a social and architectural landmark that helped transform Newport from a summer colony of wooden houses into a resort known for opulent mansions. The continuity with 660 Fifth Avenue is visible. Hunt again supplied historical power through architecture. Alva again treated a house as more than shelter. Marble House provided rooms, a facade, a setting for hosting, and an enduring claim about who could set the standard. The gap was scale and location. Fifth Avenue placed the family inside the daily movement of New York. Newport allowed a summer house to command a site associated with leisure, ocean views, and concentrated seasonal society. A guest who accepted hosting there entered a world that had been built to make the household's wealth seem like part of the landscape. This expansion changed the work required. Great summer houses needed seasonal staff, upkeep, kitchens, laundry, transportation, gardens, heating for shoulder seasons, and constant repair against weather. Imported stone and historical design did not suspend ordinary material demands. They enlarged them. The mansions also competed through comparison. One commission altered what the next client believed possible. A new facade, ballroom, dining room, holdings, or garden could make an earlier house appear restrained. Architecture turned social rivalry into durable capital. Newport added a seasonal rhythm to that capital. Households arrived, opened rooms, assembled staff, received guests, and then closed or reduced operations when the season ended. Reputation accumulated through repeated summers. A single successful event could help establish a house, but the address had to perform again when society returned. The social standard therefore attached itself to annual upkeep as well as dramatic building. That durability was partial. Families changed. Taxes, staffing, upkeep, markets, and inheritance altered the use of the houses. Some survived by becoming museums or institutions. Others disappeared. The building could outlast the social purpose that created it only by acquiring a new purpose. Marble House later did exactly that. After Alva's life changed, the property became a setting for suffrage gatherings. The same capacity to assemble people and attract press could be used for a political campaign rather than a costume ball. The tactical continuity is real, but it should not be romanticized as a plan present in 1883. At the time of the Vanderbilt ball, Alva was seeking power within an unequal elite system. Decades later, she would finance women demanding political rights denied by law. The later use of property does not cleanse the earlier display. It shows that rooms and news are tools whose purpose depends on the group using them. The immediate aftermath of 1883 was not suffrage. It was climb. More money, more architecture, more organized entertaining, and a stronger standard that private wealth should announce itself publicly. The ball's success became a standard that required new buildings to sustain. What began as a challenge to Mrs. Astor's gate was becoming an architecture of obligation. A standard becomes powerful when people must spend to avoid falling below it. McAllister's new era raised expectations for servants, flowers, food, plate, music, and rooms. Once a dinner required 5 or 6 servants plus a butler, the household that used 2 could appear less capable. Once a ball transformed an upper floor into a garden, ordinary decor risked looking insufficient. This was competition without a central rulemaker. Mrs. Astor did not issue a building code for mansions. Newspapers, guests, architects, suppliers, and hosts carried the comparisons. A house judged magnificent in one season became the model against which the next commission was described. Capital made the climb possible. Architecture made it durable. A dinner disappears into memory. A stone facade remains on the street and tells every passing rival what has been built. That visibility encourages another owner to answer with a larger site, a rarer material, a more famous architect, or a more elaborate interior. Hunt's role shows how professional power entered the contest. A client could purchase skill, but the skill was not interchangeable. Training, drawings, historical study, engineering, and networks of craftspeople allowed a commission to appear coherent. The architect could give new money a language critics had to take seriously even when they disliked the client's purpose. The suppliers also adapted. Decorators, art dealers, florists, caterers, dressmakers, jewelers, and domestic employment agencies served a market in which line depended on finding what other households did not yet possess. Scarcity became part of the product. Newspapers accelerated the comparison by turning private interiors into public benchmarks. A reader did not need to enter a dining room to learn that it contained orchids, gold plate, or an imported historical interior. Description allowed one household's purchases to shape another household's expectations. The press that helped Alva win standing also helped make the standard more expensive to maintain. Workers carried the physical cost of every new standard. More rooms meant more surfaces to clean, more fires or systems to maintain, more linen, more stairs, and greater distances between kitchen and table. A facade admired from the street created daily work behind it. The mansion converted capital into employment and also into hierarchy, dependence, and repetitive labor. The effect reached owners as well. Building cost was only the first payment. A great house required staffing, repair, heating, security, insurance, and regular entertaining if it was to continue functioning as social proof. Standing acquired through a building could become a reason the building could never be allowed to look neglected. This is why victory at the ball did not free Alva from the system. It made her one of the people expected to sustain it. The same public notice that rewarded the opening would notice a later failure. Power won through spectacle requires repeated display. The standard also preserved exclusion. A middle-class family could read about the ball and imitate a costume, a menu, or a decorative idea on a smaller scale. It could not reproduce the social network, address, staff, architecture, and capital that made the Vanderbilt event authoritative. Press coverage spread the image, while keeping the full method scarce. Old and new money therefore converged, without becoming identical. Established names gained access to expanding fortunes and modern scale. New fortunes gained standing through older rituals and professionalized taste. Both groups benefited from workers whose labor remained socially subordinate to the household. The ball changed who could compete at the top. It did not change the vertical structure that made a top possible. That structure gave elite women a field of real operational power. It also defined the limits of that power. With unusual sharpness, Alva could command a house, a guest list, and a public spectacle. She could not vote in a national election. Elite hosting could look like decor because its formal language involved clothes, flowers, food, cards, and rooms. That look concealed administration. A hostess selected participants, managed relationships, coordinated suppliers and staff, read rivalries, scheduled events, and accepted responsibility for the result. In a society that denied women political office, the household could become a serious field of power. Alva's ball makes that power unusually visible. William Vanderbilt supplied family fortune and stood as host, but the event entered history under Alva's direction. Institutional accounts consistently identify her as the organizer and strategist. Her costume, house, guest list, and use of the press formed one program. Mrs. Astor's power had the same gendered location. Her position did not come from elected office. It came from name, marriage, household practice, and repeated standing. The contest between the two women was therefore substantial without being legally formal. They could decide who met whom in important private settings, while both remained excluded from the vote. The clash should not be resolved by dismissing social power as trivial. Invitations could affect marriages, business relationships, reputations, and the daily lives of staff. A successful household could make a family acceptable, Exclusion could carry real costs. The surviving archive reflects the hierarchy. It preserves portraits of hostesses and named guests, architectural drawings signed by professional men, and newspaper descriptions of exceptional costumes. Household workers appear more often as categories: wage figures, uniforms, or movement through service space. That imbalance does not permit their stories to be invented. It does require the narration to avoid treating the hostess's visible success as the whole work. Nor should the power be mistaken for freedom. It depended on access to property and labor. A poor woman could not reproduce it by possessing equal talent. A servant woman inside the house was subject to the hostess's power without sharing its prestige. Race, class, immigration status, and family position marked the boundaries sharply. Alva's success remained tied to the Vanderbilt fortune. She could direct spending because her marriage gave her access to capital. The social order that limited women also gave a small number of married, wealthy women control over spaces in which other people's work was organized and judged. This helps explain why architecture became such a powerful medium. A house was accepted as part of a woman's domain, yet a commission could employ major architects, consume large capital, alter a city street, and shape public taste. Domesticity could carry consequences far beyond privacy. When the house occupied Fifth Avenue, the ball used that opening expertly. Alva did not ask old New York to accept a theory of women's power. She invited its leading figures into a building that demonstrated her power in work. The argument was made through success. Mrs. Astor's presence also reveals the system's flexibility. Two women could contest rank through household forms without appealing to male office holders for a final ruling. Men remained essential through money, marriage, architecture, business, and organizations like the patriarchs. The immediate decision still occurred in calls, invitations, and presence, controlled substantially by women. The result was neither emancipation nor emptiness. It was a bounded jurisdiction. Alva learned how money, property, organization, and publicity could turn that jurisdiction into public force. Later in life, she would apply those tools to divorce, to new houses, and eventually to political organizing for women's suffrage. The continuity lies in method. It does not guarantee continuity in moral purpose. Before that later campaign, Alva's exercise of family power would produce consequences that cannot be folded into a simple story of liberation. After 1883, Alva continued to build and host. Marble House rose in Newport between 1888 and 1892. The new commission placed Richard Morris Hunt's architecture inside a summer society, now competing at a higher material scale. The house became another stage on which the Vanderbilt name could appear as an power rather than an arrival. In 1895, Alva divorced William K. Vanderbilt. Divorce carried heavy social consequences for women of her class, and the decision broke with the quieter separations that often protected elite appearances. The National Park Service places the divorce inside her name for refusing the expected limits of her position. The same year brought the marriage of her daughter Consuelo Vanderbilt to Charles Spencer Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough. That marriage has its own extensive record and its own Dynasty and Dust episode. It does not need to be repeated here. Its presence matters because it reveals the coercive side of the social power Alva had mastered. The mother who had challenged Mrs. Astor's gate could enforce another gate against her daughter. Wealth and household power did not become benign because a woman exercised them. The social system gave Alva room to resist some expectations and to impose others. Her later marriage to Oliver Belmont created another phase. After his death, Alva's public activity moved increasingly toward women's political rights. She supported suffrage organizations, hosted gatherings, financed campaigns, and used her fame to draw notice to a cause that many established people treated as radical. The National Park Service identifies her as president and primary benefactor of the National Woman's Party. Her money helped sustain campaigns for the 19th Amendment. Her resources later helped the group secure a permanent headquarters in Washington. Funding is easy to describe as a background condition, yet it changes what and when a group can attempt. Rent, printing, travel, staff, meeting space, legal support, and news all require resources. Alva's contribution did not make her the movement's sole author. It gave organizers a financial base from which larger and more confrontational campaigns could be sustained. Marble House became part of that political work. Gatherings for women's right to vote took place in a property originally created as a monument to elite domestic life. The change in use was substantial. The method remained recognizable. Bring people into a controlled setting. Use property to confer being seen. Invite press notice. Convert private wealth into an organized public result. No evidence shows that the 1883 ball was secretly planning for suffrage. That interpretation would make later history inevitable and flatten the changes in Alva's life. The stronger conclusion is that she developed and repeatedly used a set of techniques before applying them to different ends. Those techniques included spectacle, but spectacle alone was never enough. The ball required invitations and labor. Suffrage campaigns required organizations, officers, publications, demonstrations, legal goals, and people willing to face arrest. Money could provide infrastructure and notice. It could not substitute for the work of activists across many backgrounds. Alva's fame also brought respectability to tactics some Americans feared. The old skills of social standing could be redirected. A cause hosted at Marble House entered a setting that critics associated with wealth, taste, and public interest. The property could make a radical demand harder for elite observers to dismiss as socially marginal. The later chapter therefore extends the episode's central method. Public power grows when resources, place, group, and notice reinforce one another. The moral value depends on what that power is used to accomplish and who bears its cost. Alva's life supplies no simple verdict. It supplies a durable method, repeatedly adapted. A celebratory account could begin with the ball, pass quickly over the forced marriage of Consuelo, and arrive at suffrage as proof that Alva had always been breaking barriers. A condemning account could reverse the choice, treating the political work as a late ornament on a life devoted to control. Neither plan owns the whole record. The strongest challenge to a story of tactical continuity is moral. A method can remain recognizable while the power relations change. The guest list at 665th Avenue reinforced exclusion. A National Woman's Party campaign sought legal inclusion. Calling both uses of organization does not make their purposes equivalent. That challenge is correct. The continuity should not erase the gap. It should show what wealth allowed one person to do across different institutions. Alva could hire, build, host, publish, donate, and attract notice at a scale unavailable to most women. Those resources could defend rank, direct family choices, or finance political challenge. The record also resists an easy psychological account. We do not need to claim that Alva felt one hidden motive through every phase. People change, circumstances change, interests conflict. A woman can resist a husband's power, coerce a daughter, exclude social rivals, and support voting rights without those actions resolving into one private essence. History becomes more accurate when clash is allowed to remain attached to the same person. It prevents later public good from laundering earlier harm. It also prevents earlier harm from making later public work invisible. The material settings help hold the clash. Marble House was created through Vanderbilt wealth as an emblem of social arrival. Later, it hosted suffrage gatherings. The same rooms did not mean the same thing at every date. Property outlived one use and acquired another. The 665th Avenue house had a shorter afterlife. It was sold and ultimately demolished in the 1920s as the avenue changed from a mansion district toward commercial and denser residential uses. That history belongs more fully to another episode. Here, the disappearance serves one limited point. A building meant to make status permanent did not remain permanent. The photographs, plans, press reports, and costumes survived in scattered institutions. They preserved the house as evidence rather than as a place. That survival favors what could be photographed, collected, and cataloged. It does not preserve the shift of every worker, every private exchange, or every person kept outside. The limits matter because the ball's public power depended on selective visibility. The press saw decorated rooms. Guests saw service as completed. Crowds saw arrivals. Museums later preserved exceptional costumes. Ordinary labor and exclusion appear indirectly through wages, routes, costs, and the line outside. Alva understood how to control the visible field. Later suffrage organizations also understood that being seen could change political cost. Demonstrations at the White House made denial visible. Newspapers carried arrests and imprisonment to people who did not attend meetings. The political context was entirely different, but public observation again altered what power could do quietly. That is as far as the comparison should go. The evidence supports continuity in the tools, not a claim of one uninterrupted cause. It supports moral complexity without requiring a final balance sheet of virtue. The episode can now return to the 400. The later printed list shows exactly how the old gate adapted after events like Alva's ball had made private standing a public contest. When the New York Times published McAllister's official list in 1892, it converted social ambiguity into a newspaper object. Readers could scan names, notice omissions, dispute spellings, and mock the power behind the choice. The gate had gained a printed form and lost some of the protection that came from remaining unwritten. The list was an adaptation. McAllister responded to competing claims about who counted. Public appetite for sorting had grown strong enough that silence left the field to other newspapers and other arbiters. By supplying his roster, he defended power and exposed it to review at the same time. Publication invited a kind of scrutiny that a ballroom judgment avoided. A reader could count the names and discover that the number did not behave as advertised. Families could object to an omission. Critics could turn McAllister's verbal habits and title into ridicule. The list tried to settle ease in a ballroom through typography, then revealed how much discretion had always sat behind the number. The Vanderbilt name belonged inside this later world. That inclusion did not prove that all old families accepted every Vanderbilt equally. It did show that the family's wealth, marriages, houses, and events had become part of the elite order no serious classifier could ignore. The 1883 ball helped make that outcome visible before the list existed. Mrs. Astor, Carrie, and McAllister had entered the house. Reporters described the event. McAllister later placed the period inside his new era. Social standing was established through practice first and classified later. This sequence repays the correction from the opening. Alva did not storm a fixed 400 and force her name onto a page. She helped create a public fact that later pages had to accommodate. The gap is less cinematic and more consequential. It shows a system changing through use before it changed through language. The gate remained. McAllister still distinguished ease from discomfort, knobs from swells, and acceptable newcomers from people he believed did not belong. Mrs. Astor's power did not vanish after one night. Exclusion continued through clubs, schools, marriages, neighborhoods, invitations, and private judgments too numerous for any list. What changed was the gate's claim to invisibility. New fortunes could challenge a refusal with houses, hosting, alliances, and press notice. Newspapers could turn the dispute into public party. Satirists could expose the borrowed costumes of both old and new aristocracy. The gatekeepers had to explain themselves in a city whose economic scale kept producing challengers. This is why the ball changed who ruled without making rule disappear. Mrs. Astor represented inherited standing. Alva demonstrated a new route to standing. McAllister tried to reconcile the two by admitting swells who could move comfortably among knobs. The resulting society remained unequal, but its power was shared across a wider and more competitive group of fortunes. The cost of that widening fell downward, as well as outward. More mansions, more servants, more specialized trades, more display, and more public interest did not transfer control to the workers producing them. The top enlarged and raised its standard. The phrase 400 made the top sound fixed. The printed list proved how difficult fixation had become. A society confident in its boundaries would not need a newspaper to insist that one list was official. By 1892, Marble House had also been completed. The architecture of the new order stood in Newport, while its names were being debated in New York print. Alva had moved from applicant to standard setter. The final evidence is therefore not a card or a list alone. It is the convergence of paper, stone, crowds, labor, and one surviving dress. Together they show what the ball made possible and what it left unchanged. The house at 665th Avenue is gone. Its carved facade no longer interrupts the modern street. The rooms that carried the quadrilles, supper, and indoor garden cannot be entered. What remains is distributed. A photograph at the Library of Congress, a third-floor plan, an interior image, newspaper reports, McAllister's memoir, museum portraits, the electric light dress. Each object preserves a different part of the method. The exterior shows that the Vanderbilt claim occupied permanent urban ground. The plan shows that spectacle required organized space. The press record shows that Alva admitted a public audience before the private one arrived. McAllister's account shows an insider naming a new era of fortunes, servants, and expensive hosting. The dress shows new money presenting industrial modernity as a source of power. The visiting card story survives among them, elegant and uncertain. It may record a real maneuver. It may compress a slower acceptance into the form later readers preferred. The episode does not need to decide more than the evidence allows. Mrs. Astor's presence is enough to establish standing. The press preview and street crowd explain why that standing traveled. Hunt's house explains why presence meant more than appearing at a rented hall. The labor and cost categories explain how private capital produced apparent ease. The later 400 chronology shows the old order adapting after the contest had become public. Alva's victory was therefore bounded. She did not abolish hierarchy. She did not give ordinary New Yorkers access to the rooms. She did not replace inherited rank with a fair measure of merit. She proved that economic power, professional design, organization, and publicity could force inherited rank to negotiate. That bargain changed who could set the standard. Old names remained valuable. New fortunes gained the ability to make refusal costly. The resulting elite was broader at the top, more spectacular in public, and still dependent on workers whose labor rarely received equal notice. The ball also imposed its own discipline on the winners. Once the Vanderbilts had used a house to prove power, they had to keep building, hosting, maintaining, and responding to comparison. Marble House followed. Newport escalated. The show of status consumed capital and work, because standing had become visible enough to require renewal. That discipline helps explain why the event belongs to a history of systems rather than a gallery of curiosities. The cattails, jeweled peacock, orchids, champagne figures, and electric torch attract notice because they are strange. Their historical value comes from the work they reveal. Each required resources to move through a network and return as social meaning attached to a name. The same evidence also keeps the scale honest. A great party can alter a bargain without remaking a city by itself. The economy, press, architecture, family alliances, and labor system had been changing before March 26. Alva's success was to assemble those pressures into one result that contemporaries could see and later historians could test. Alva later carried parts of the method into suffrage organizing. Property became a meeting place. Wealth financed campaigns. Fame attracted press. That later purpose deserves credit without turning the earlier social contest into a secret rehearsal for equality. The same tools can serve different systems. The title promise can now be answered precisely. The ball changed who ruled Gilded Age New York because it made old money standing publicly negotiable. Mrs. Astor could still judge. She could no longer make the judgment as though the Vanderbilts were invisible. Too many guests had crossed the threshold. Too many readers knew it. Too much stone, labor, and spectacle had turned presence into evidence. 9 years later, McAllister printed a list and called it official. The sequence reveals the deeper result. Classification followed recognition. The page attempted to settle a society that events like Alva's ball had already forced to move. The final residue is the electric light ensemble. It once entered a French-style house among guests, dressed as European history. The house vanished. The formal list became a historical interest. The dress remained, its lightning still traced across white satin. Old New York had guarded its power through ancestry, ritual, and private judgment. On one night in 1883, the new fortunes entered, dressed as the future, and the gatekeepers came to watch.